Gee, they're all excited about another emissions reduction law in Canberra today, aren't they? Global warming, climate change, climate crisis, climate action, climate emergency, climate wars. You hear little else in this country, not in the rest of the world, mind you, but in Australia we seem to be obsessed with this. The alarmism, of course, is off the charts. When the country faces one of its regular devastating droughts, the activists and politicians use the trauma to advocate for climate action. They say global warming dries out the land. And then, when bushfires come at the end of the drought, these same people don't talk about fuel reduction or keeping buildings away from the bush or planning to survive inevitable bushfires. Instead, they pretend climate policies can reduce the bushfire threat. And then, when the floods end the drought, as they tend to do, these activists and politicians tell us global warming floods the land, and instead of moving development away from floodplains or building dams to control rivers, they advocate for climate action to reduce the threat from flooding. Imagine that. Change the climate to get rid of drought and change the climate to get rid of floods. This stuff just goes on and on, as you know. Any weather event, any pain, they just use it to promote their desired action. And it is action in this country that cannot actually help. And they also love to tell us that without their action, then natural wonders, beautiful environments like the Great Barrier Reef will be destroyed.
Today's announcement is about ensuring that future generations get to enjoy the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef, of course, we know, is vulnerable. It's been neglected by this government.
The incredible natural glory of the Great Barrier Reef is threatened.
But what about the news today on the Great Barrier Reef? Why isn't this dominating the media or the political debate? Scientists have found the reef is going through a growth spurt, despite bleaching episodes in the recent past. Long-term monitoring by the Australian Institute of Marine Science shows the best coral growth on record. That's over a period of about 4 decades. It is good news on the environment, stuff our kids should know about. The trouble is that politicians and the media only want to preach doom and gloom and alarmism. And they give us a very warped view, don't they? And they were at it again in Canberra today, pushing more climate action, focusing on climate change as the #1 issue of this new Labor Greens government and the #1 issue for this country, which is kind of weird, given we produce about 1% of global emissions and our annual emissions, along with our global share, are shrinking, while global emissions are rising by a much greater number. Yes, because of that reality, what we do is actually irrelevant to the global outcome, irrelevant to the environment and irrelevant to the climate. That's just the fact. That's just the science, the reality. As confirmed, of course, by former Chief Scientist Alan Finkel more than 5 years ago. Now, I want to show you this in context. This is the Chief Scientist who does support Australia taking climate action, as you'll hear from him. Nonetheless, he's being frank about the impact, even when our share of global emissions was higher than it is today.
In terms of the need for us to worry about our tiny contribution, to me, and this is where I apologise, it's a little bit like voting. Does your vote count in an election? Does my vote count in an election? No, it doesn't. But if everybody took the attitude that their vote doesn't count and no one voted, we wouldn't have a democracy.
But, Doctor, you're entering into an argument which I'm not having. I mean, I didn't put those propositions to you. I simply asked a question. If we reduce the world's carbon emissions by 1.3%, what impact would that have on the changing climate of the world?
Virtually nothing.
Okay.
Yep, virtually nothing. And our share of global emissions today is closer to 1%. And we're tying ourselves in knots about whether we fiddle with 28% reductions of our 1% or 43% reductions of our 1%. And the result will be less than virtually nothing, of course, because whatever we cut here is being replaced, and some, by increasing emissions in China and elsewhere. Yet none of this reality permeates Canberra. In the rarefied atmosphere of the national capital, in the Canberra bubble, they pretend that the climate extremes that have always bedevilled us and always will can be tamed by their lawmaking and their amendments after yet another climate bill passed the lower house today.
Which Australians have been impacted by droughts and floods and bushfires? No. The impact of climate change is real. We need a response which is real. The government is offering that.
It's embarrassing, isn't it? It is clearly delusional, deceptive and delusional. And I'm no anti-scientist or anti-environmentalist. I studied parks and wildlife management before I went into the media. My dream was to be a park ranger. I accept the science and I accept that Australia must do its bit. We are doing our bit and have been doing our bit. But I don't accept that we should scare our children with alarmist claptrap. I do not accept that we should harm our economy, impoverish ourselves for no environmental gain. For no environmental gain. And I don't accept that we can pretend that floods and fires can be stopped by emissions gestures. To save lives and property from floods and fires, we need to plan for floods and plan for fires. We need to make ourselves safe from them because they are inevitable and they are unstoppable, and politicians pretending otherwise are a dangerous embarrassment. And Canberra is full of them.
Ecosystems will collapse and more species will become extinct and more of us will die.
Climate scientists are telling us we need a 2030 emissions target reduction of at least 50% to prevent catastrophic climate change.
This amendment aims to broaden the legislation beyond the setting of a number.
There is opportunity to go beyond the 43% cut in carbon emissions.
Then you need pollution cuts of 75%. That is crystal clear. That is the science.
Yeah, and while they continue with all this delusion, other issues are ignored. Stuff where they could actually make practical changes, stuff where they could actually do some useful work is ignored, like getting your power bills down and ensuring we actually have energy security in this country, like making sure this country actually has the equipment and the ability to defend itself, like overturning the tragic reality that means Indigenous kids are twice as likely to die as infants in this country and dramatically less likely to finish school or get a job compared to non-Indigenous kids, like helping communities protect themselves from inevitable floods and fires, like reducing taxes, shrinking government and starting to repay debt. You see, there are some things our politicians can change, but they choose not to. They choose not to do that stuff because it's too hard. They choose instead to pretend they can change the climate. They are treating you like fools.